going to put you on the spot here. Do you think that CM Punk got himself fired from AEW on purpose?
Yes, I do.
August 27th, 2023. An impressive 80,000 people filled London's Wembley Stadium. Before the pay-per-view even officially started, fans in attendance had no idea that an event had just taken place that would shake up the wrestling world. When the All In pay-per-view started, CM Punk, who had just recently returned to the company, would make his way to the ring for the very last time in All Elite Wrestling. So what happened? Well, most wrestling fans already know the gist of the story by now, but the context is important. This is a channel about wrestling lore after all, so here we go. CM Punk's time in AEW was eventful to say the least. Several backstage incidents would lead to Punk becoming increasingly hostile toward the AEW locker room and its management. Punk would engage in a feud with Hangman Adam Page, which would see the two throw unscripted jabs at one another during in-ring promos and other media. Hangman would make reference to a rumor that Punk had thrown his weight around to get former best friend Colt Cabana fired from AEW. This would seemingly enrage Punk, who would call out Adam several times over the following months, claiming that Adam had gone into business for himself and acted unprofessionally. Rumors were certainly circulating at that time that Punk had heat with several of the higher-ups in the AEW locker room, namely the Young Bucks and Hangman Adam Page. On September 4th, 2022, after his match with Jon Moxley, Punk would appear alongside Tony Khan in the post-show press conference and dropped one of the most infamous rants in pro wrestling history.
An empty-headed, fucking dumb like Hangman Adam Page to go into business for himself. We have irresponsible people who call themselves EVPs and couldn't freaking manage a target. And they spread lies and bullshit, and I will still walk up and down this hallway and say, if you have a fucking problem with me, take it up with me. Let's fucking go.
After the press conference, Punk would head to the dressing room where a real fight would ensue. Reportedly, the Young Bucks and Kenny Omega kicked in the door to confront Punk on his press conference remarks, and a fight would break out. All of this would take place while Tony Khan was still addressing reporters in a separate room. We can even see Chris Jericho join the panel and seemingly inform Tony Khan that something went down in the locker room and would need to be addressed as soon as possible. All those involved in the backstage altercation would receive a suspension, with Punk remaining absent from the company for nearly 10 months due to this incident as well as an injury. Punk returned to the company on the first episode of AEW's new weekly show, AEW Collision. Punk's return was met with a mixed reaction from the wrestling fanbase. Stories had been circulating of Punk's heat with the locker room for the better part of 2 years now, and fans were beginning to turn on CM Punk.
The AEW Collision will feature CM Punk.
That's awesome!
After his return from injury, it would only be mere weeks before stories began circulating once again about a backstage incident between Punk and, this time, Jack Perry. The story goes that Perry had a pre-approved week off for a planned vacation and wanted to do a backstage segment on Collision that would write him off of TV to explain his absence. According to Punk, Perry had come up with an idea that involved Perry using a steel pipe to break the window of a rental car. Perry was apparently adamant that it be real glass in the segment, which would be the main source of the controversy. Several AEW staff members reportedly told Perry that it was unsafe to use real glass. This led to Perry cussing out all those who told him no. Tony Schiavone would approach Punk to ask him to speak with Perry, to which Punk was hesitant but agreed. Punk would reportedly tell Perry that we don't use real glass here. If you want to use glass, you can do that on Wednesdays, but not here. Meaning that Perry can do what he wants on AEW's Dynamite without Punk's presence, but while on Collision, they were not going to use real glass and damage a rental car. This led to a back and forth argument, but it wouldn't necessarily make front page news. However, sources claim that Punk referred to this incident as Perry throwing a temper tantrum, which could only add fuel to the fire. Other sources have suggested that Punk was a lot more angry than what was reported. Supposedly, Punk had taken issue with Perry over liking a negative tweet about Punk, and Punk was not asked by AEW higher-ups to speak with Perry, but rather took issue with the segment personally and decided to confront him. Some sources even claim that the segment was in fact approved by Tony Khan, but Punk still felt it was an unsafe or unnecessary spot to do. These sources claim that this was the real issue, as Punk was inserting himself into the conversation and acting as if he had final say. This can only be seen as speculation, as no parties involved have outright confirmed this. However, Punk does have a certain leader complex that he has tried to enact on multiple occasions before, so it's not exactly out of the realm of possibility for Punk to behave as the, quote, locker room leader.
There's a thing in wrestling, the locker room leader. Whenever somebody says, I'm a locker room leader, you definitely know that guy is not the locker room leader.
Cody, do you remember this weird locker room meeting in WWE once where CM Punk said that? Do you remember that?
So I tried
do you remember that?
I tried not to name names.
I'll say it because it's my cruise.
But
do you remember they said
multiple times
as the locker room leader? I'm like, you don't lead me.
There was one meeting where Booker T was in the room and Punk hit the, as the locker room leader, I'm telling you guys all to pick up your trash, and Booker literally threw his trash on the floor.
If Punk considered himself the leader of the AEW locker room and approached Perry with that mindset, it's easy to see how that could cause friction with those who were there from day one. But either way, this argument between Punk and Perry wouldn't amount to much until a few weeks later at a Collision taping on August 12, 2023. Punk reportedly was involved in another argument with Ryan Nemeth, who was actually sent home from the taping following this incident. Punk reportedly took issue with a tweet that Nemeth had made after Punk's return, in which he called Punk literally the softest man alive in response to Punk's on-air digs at the Young Bucks.
Because I am the one true, genuine article in a business full of counterfeit bucks.
Following the Nemeth incident, dirt sheets began poking around for the story, and somebody close to CM Punk would bring up the Jack Perry incident once again. The story would be reported painting Perry in a negative light over his real glass incident, again referring to him as having had a temper tantrum. Meltzer would report that Punk's issue with the real glass segment stemmed from the belief that Perry was just looking for an easy week off. Punk would later confirm that this was in fact his belief at the time.
I don't know anything about Jack going on vacation. All I know is there's a litany of people that they work one day a week and they don't want to. So they want to show up and wrestle and then film vignettes and then sit at home for 4 weeks. Great. But not on my show.
Jack Perry was portrayed in the media as lazy or unwilling to work the shows that he was booked for. Assuming the story of him taking a planned vacation is true and wasn't trying to take liberties with his schedule, this obviously would upset Perry. It can't be known what his true intentions were, but either way, being labeled as lazy and childish in a public manner isn't exactly a good look. Perry would remain silent about the situation until the night of the All In pay-per-view on August 27, 2023. During the pre-show, dubbed 0 Hour, Jack Perry would take on Hook for the FTW Championship. Most of this match took place on top of or around a parked limousine at the top of the entranceway. At one point during the match, Perry would turn to the camera and say the words,
This is right here.
And then crushing.
Real glass.
Crushing the
Go
abdomen.
cry me a river.
The remainder of the show would go on without a hitch, but fans would soon find out that those words had set in motion one of the most interesting pieces of backstage drama that we've seen in recent years. After his match, Perry would return to the locker room to an angry CM Punk, who was moments away from heading to the ring himself for his match with Samoa Joe. Punk and Perry would get into a physical altercation, and Punk's opponent, Samoa Joe, would break the two up and calm them down. This scuffle infamously made Tony Khan fearful for his life.
My life was in danger.
Within weeks of the incident, Punk was fired from AEW. Punk's time in AEW was definitely a bumpy ride. Punk has been known for speaking his mind, not backing down from confrontation, and has found himself in controversial waters on more than one occasion throughout his career. However, this time in AEW was the first time things got physical on not one, but two occasions. When Punk left WWE in 2014, his war with his former employer ultimately gave him legendary status. People saw him as a martyr who had been mistreated by an evil corporation. And maybe so. However, this time his incidents in AEW seemingly tarnished that legacy, and fans began to think that maybe Punk was the problem all along. Despite his rocky past with the WWE, Punk would make his long-awaited return to the company after nearly a decade absence. While Punk has had some very public issues with WWE in the past, there have been no stories of any altercations or backstage drama centered around Punk since his return to the WWE. Reflecting on the situation, the fans' perception of Punk has changed dramatically. During his time in AEW, he was labeled a bully, egotistical, a diva, and even referred to as a cancer to the AEW locker room. Since joining WWE, however, the sentiment seems to be that Punk is getting along well with the locker room and has just wrapped up one of the best on-screen feuds in recent memory with Drew McIntyre. This has led fans to question who was really at fault here. Was Punk the aggressor backstage, or was he telling the truth when he infamously said,
I'm hurt and I'm old and I'm retired and I work with children.
With the puzzle only half finished, fans naturally began crafting theories on why Punk seems to be a different person now than he was just over a year ago. One theory that's begun to gain some traction is that CM Punk planned to be fired from the company so that he could go back to the WWE, with some even going so far as to suggest that this was a plan concocted by Punk and Triple H long before Punk ever signed a contract with AEW. The more conspiratorial side of this theory suggests that when Punk was brought back into the wrestling world under Fox Sports 1 in November of 2019, Punk began having more and more open discussions with WWE higher-ups, namely the Game Triple H. This theory suggests that Punk's cancerous presence in AEW was a scheme hatched by Punk and Triple H to A. rebuild the trust between Punk and the WWE, essentially earning Punk's spot back in the company's good graces, and B. to hurt the morale of their new competitor and paint their organization as unprofessional, which, to be honest, is a pretty common sentiment these days. To explore this conspiracy a little bit further, one could imagine that Punk and Triple H knew the public would buy a story of Punk acting out and fighting with members of the roster, as Punk has always been a magnet for controversy. bringing him into the WWE after sabotaging AEW and then giving him some good storylines would soon correct Punk's relationship with the fans, and they would have rebuilt Punk as a loose cannon which can be used effectively in future storylines. When Punk returned at Survivor Series, they seemed to lean heavily into this idea, with reports of Seth Rollins and Drew McIntyre being extremely upset at Punk's return. Some outlets even reported that Drew McIntyre was so upset that he left the building. This would all turn out to be a work, and they were building off the idea that Punk was a cancer to any locker room he entered. If the last 3 to 4 years was all part of the plan, they pulled it off expertly. After all, Triple H is a fan of long-term storytelling. Furthermore, some claim it seems odd that Punk was basically blacklisted from WWE for the better part of a decade, and after Punk's somewhat disastrous run in AEW, he seemed more volatile than ever. So why would WWE invite him back with such open arms? Prior to his return to WWE, Punk seemed to be nothing but problematic, causing backstage tension and even coming to blows on multiple occasions. At that time, you would assume Punk would be the last type of person you would want in your locker room. The theory that they worked together all along might explain why WWE was so willing to bring him back. However, it's important to note that WWE was going through significant changes in leadership at this time. Vince McMahon had stepped down in 2022, and by the third quarter of 2023, the WWE was sold to TKO for $21 billion. So while Punk may have certainly been blackballed by Vince, that was no longer an issue. Punk and Triple H haven't always seen eye to eye, but it's possible Triple H could see the money in bringing a guy like Punk into the company, especially after such a controversial exit from their competitor. It's also been speculated that TKO themselves were the ones to push for Punk's return. Because of the media coverage Punk had been receiving since his return to wrestling, he was naturally going to be a massive draw for the company. But to be frank, there's very little evidence to support the theory that Punk and WWE were working together all along. But that doesn't mean there's none whatsoever. During Punk's 10-month absence from AEW, Punk was spotted outside the Allstate Arena where Raw was being held that night. In the video that was posted to social media, all we see is Punk speaking with Tamina Snuka in the parking lot, and an obnoxious fan borderline blackmailing Punk for a picture while recording the video.
Hey, CM Punk, we won't tell you here if you come over here and take some pictures. I see you over there with that red cap.
Nevertheless, some have speculated he was there to meet with Triple H to put the final stages of their plan in action and get released from his AEW contract. Punk would later deny that any talks about coming back to WWE during this visit ever happened, and would even state he was thrown out of the building under the orders of Vince McMahon.
I'm the old timer in the business, and there's a show in town, and I wasn't trying to get a job or anything. I literally went, and I saw, like, the few people that I saw before I got thrown out.
It's quite unlikely that Punk and WWE had planned the entire 2-year run in AEW. However, there could certainly be some truth to the idea that Punk was fed up with AEW following his media scrum incident in 2022, and despite Punk downplaying his backstage visit, he could have been there to simply test the waters. He could see what the reception was like backstage, who his friends were, and what kind of atmosphere was in the locker room when he arrived. This would give him something to at least compare to the AEW locker room. Of course, one visit wouldn't give you all that you needed to know, but it would definitely give you some idea on if there was any sort of opportunity there. Punk name drops a few other wrestlers as being very nice to him, and even said that he did see Triple H there, though it was a brief visit. Nevertheless, it's interesting that he would even consider showing up backstage after nearly a decade had passed. just a few years prior, that would never have been a thought. According to Punk in the same interview with Ariel Helwani, he did in fact ask Tony Khan for his release during his 10-month absence from the company, but Tony refused.
Tony's big idea was separate show. We're going to separate everybody. And I said, that'll never work. Just let me go. I've already been off TV. I hurt this arm. Just get me out of here. No, can't let you go.
This means that Punk was under contract, he was looking to get out of it, and was willing to speak with his once bitter rival, WWE. Almost immediately getting into an argument with Jack Perry upon returning to AEW certainly seems like Punk could have had an agenda. Some believe that Punk went into the All In pay-per-view with every intention of being fired from the company by the end of the evening, and had been his plan ever since his return to the company just a few weeks prior. Though some might argue it seems a little bit convenient that Perry would be the one to throw the first shot at Punk during the pay-per-view. If Perry hadn't made that real glass remark, there would be no cause for a backstage confrontation. This convenience has even led to a small group of people believing that Punk and Perry were in on it together, perhaps to give Perry a rub on Punk's way out, which he has seemingly tried to capitalize on with his scapegoat gimmick. The idea that they were working together is pure speculation and a little far-fetched. The theory doesn't have much to support it. However, once the footage of the altercation was bizarrely aired on AEW TV a few months later, it doesn't exactly look like, to quote Tony Khan, a life-threatening situation. It's really only a couple of shoves and a front face lock that we see in the fight, which has led some to believe that this backstage altercation was just as real as the fights we see in the ring. According to Punk, he did proceed to yell at Tony Khan after this incident, which could be where things escalated between Punk and Khan to threats of aggression, but only those who were there can know for sure. Nevertheless, Punk got his wish and was released from AEW, and 3 months later, debuted at Survivor Series and has seemingly played nice ever since. Conspiracies are fun, but as with most of them, it's likely that the truth here is somewhere in the middle. Punk probably did want out of his AEW contract. The Young Bucks, Adam Page, and Jack Perry probably don't like him, but the entire thing being orchestrated by Punk and Triple H is probably not true. However, wrestling is a business that is built on blurring the lines between fact and fiction. Every bit of drama, both on-screen or off-screen, invites curiosity. Is it a work or is it a shoot? And the beauty of professional wrestling is that we will probably never know for sure.